You're watching Salina Media Connection. Professor Paul Mkandawire spoke to students and faculty at the campus of the KU Schools of Medicine and Nursing about public health responses to the outbreak of Ebola in West Africa in 2014. While he said the response demonstrated the success of modern medicine, he argued some of the actions taken by African governments in response to the outbreak created backlash among their citizens. Mkandawire also argued racial prejudice influenced how health officials and the media discussed the crisis. Mkandawire is an assistant professor of health sciences at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Much of his research concerns the intersection of global public health and human rights.
Health Education Center that houses the University of Kansas Schools of Medicine and Schools of Nursing. I am Dr. Lisa Larson. I'm the Dean for the School of Nursing, and we're very glad to have you here. If you are wanting any information about either of our programs, we do have some brochures and fact sheets down at the end of the lobby that you can pick up later. And so now I'm going to turn it over to the program presenters.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lisa Larson and Jill Weber for welcoming us to your beautiful campus. Don't remember being in such a nice and beautiful building. It's good. So I would like to welcome you to the fourth installment of our seminar series that's titled Chronic Conditions, Knowing, Seeing and Healing the Body in Global Africa. Chronic Conditions is a year-long series, seminar series investigating the historical, cultural and structural processes that have given rise to chronic health conditions among Africans, African immigrants and African Americans. Through discussions, lectures, performances, and humanities-based labs, Chronic Conditions will set a new agenda for interdisciplinary research in the medical humanities, while amplifying the voices of diverse senior and emerging scholars from across the globe. In the United States, African Americans are more likely than whites to die from initial heart attack, lose a child in infancy, experience higher rates of rheumatoid arthritis, obesity, and diabetes, and be treated less aggressively and effectively for cancer, pain, and depression. Parallels in these disparities have been noted in communities in African immigrants and in Africa, where age-specific mortality rates from these chronic diseases are higher than in any other region of the world. Through a focus on communities that share African roots, seminar participants trace how legacies of slavery, colonialism, and segregation have rendered black bodies vulnerable, particularly vulnerable to these conditions. Chronic conditions respond to these chronic disease morbidity and mortality rates occurring in the face of unequivocal evidence that racialist assumptions, implicit bias, and overt discrimination are present in healthcare systems around the world. The seminar combines a humanistic focus on the relations of power and systems of meaning that structure and reproduce these social and epidemiological effects with the transformative power of art and storytelling. Our ultimate goal is to demonstrate how the humanities, arts, and social sciences are fundamentally important contributors to medical knowledge and practices by challenging taken for granted assumptions and generating new forms of understanding. And the Chronic Conditions Seminar is sponsored by the Andrew Mellon Foundation and led by the All Center for Humanities, the Spencer Museum of Arts, and the Kansas African Studies Center at the University of Kansas. And for today's talk, we are especially grateful to Lucy and Mike Kohoff and Donna Van Diva for facilitating the visits and for handling the conference, the workshop logistics. We would also like to thank the University Honors Program and the Office of the Chancellor at the University of Kansas for contributing financially to this seminar series. And many of the people in the audience here today, they are from the University of Kansas, from the University Honors Program, from the Multicultural Scholars Program, from the African and African American Studies Department, and also from the Kansas African Studies Department. And for today, we are honored to have Dr. Paul Mkandawire, who's going to talk about the international framing of HIV, AIDS, and Ebola, looking at the place of Africa in the global health landscape. And a bit of background about Dr. Paul Mkandawire. He is the co-director of the Human Rights and Social Justice Program, and he's also an associate professor of health sciences at Carleton University in Ottawa, in Canada. He holds a PhD in geography from Western University, so we actually went to the same university, had the same advisors. And he also holds a Master of Science degree from the Imperial College of London. So he has studied in London, in the United Kingdom, and then London, Ontario, in Canada. So his research is broadly located at the intersection of global and public health and human rights. It is predicated on the promise that the promotion and protection of human health are intimately linked to the promotion and protection of human rights and social justice. He applies qualitative and quantitative methods to the investigation of dimensions that link the environment and human health, and of synergies between public health and human rights. He is also interested in providing a better understanding of how state and non-state institutions mobilize responses to epidemics of global proportions and human rights and social justice implications of global health policies. Currently, Dr. Mkandawire holds cross appointments in the departments of geography, the Institute of African Studies, and the Institute of Health, Science, Technology, and Policy at Carleton University in Canada. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Mkandawire.
Thank you so much for such a generous introduction. I want to start by thanking the organizers of this seminar for inviting me to share some of my experiences and thinking around issues of health and human rights. Initially, when I got the invitation, I thought maybe I shouldn't come because I'm on sabbatical and other things. But looking at the theme of this seminar series and the issues that are being addressed, I felt compelled as an African scholar to make a contribution. I also would like to very much thank colleagues in the organizing committee, in the organizing team of the speaker series for mounting what I would characterize as a sort of a hostage rescue operation last night. I was stuck in Toronto for 8 hours. You know, I live in Ottawa, but Ottawa is not very far from Kansas City. It's supposed to be about 3-4 hours flight, but I was stuck the whole day in Toronto for known reasons that are so specific to Canada. Weather. So I was worried, and I know you guys were also worried, but my family was equally worried. So you didn't just rescue me so that I could be present tonight. You actually bailed out my family as well. So I really thank you so much for that. My past 10 years have focused on studying HIV/AIDS. I'm a medical geographer, and I study the geographic structure of disease epidemics. So how do disease epidemics diffuse in space? And how do they move from one place to another? That's my disciplinary sort of background, and I have applied those kind of skills to the understanding of the social epidemiology of HIV/AIDS for the past 10 years. And recently, I've developed interest in trying to understand how state and non-state actors respond to epidemics of global proportions. What makes them respond in the way they do? And what are the concerns that trigger them respond the way they do beyond the immediate need of the epidemic, of the disease itself? In other words, my work in this area has led me to understand that definitions of what constitutes a public health emergency or an epidemic are not only biological. They embody other concerns as well. And within that, I've wrestled with a lot of questions trying to understand how the Ebola epidemic was addressed from the number of actors that were involved. So even though the abstract that I sent earlier was much more expansive and focused on a number of things, as you know, anybody who has ever attended a conference, when they say write an abstract, you jump on board and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. But when it comes to writing, and they say, am I really going to do what I said I was going to do? Is it feasible? Can I really do it? You know? So what I'll present today will focus on the 2014 West Africa Ebola outbreak. This crisis was officially declared that it was over by mid-2016. So it started in late 2013, officially considered an outbreak early 2014, ran the course through 2015. Around late 2015, early 2016, it was considered to be officially over in all the three major countries where the epidemic actually ran. Of course, the World Health Organization, came under intense criticism, and came under fire for its initial sluggish response and for failing to read the signs on the wall. At least not being able to do that soon enough to nick the epidemic or the outbreak in the bud. But overall, I think you agree with me that the official declaration of the end of the epidemic was actually characterized by a lot of fanfare, a lot of sense of ease, and in some cases, triumph, especially amongst those of us who live in the West. Okay? And we marveled at the wonders that medicine can do. Especially modern medicine, which is completely in order. And that's the dominant story that keeps coming and coming. If you read journals, they keep drumming that story, that the Ebola epidemic's end was a success and was good for everyone. We should all celebrate that Ebola came to an end. But there's another side of the story that is rarely talked about. Little, if any, of that includes an assessment that takes stock at the immense socio-cultural ravages left behind by the international response to the Ebola epidemic. The violent nature of the response itself, the havoc it actually wrought on the population, the way states quickly rounded up people and mobilized responses that were in ways draconian, is a story that never really comes up in conversations around or about the success of the Ebola epidemic. In most cases, largely seen as collateral damage, stories of state-sanctioned violence, massive social dislocation, and toxic division of ethnic groups in countries still reeling from the ravages of the Civil War, Liberia, Sierra Leone, those stories don't make into the headlines. Conversations around, the general racist character of the response itself, right, are often sidestepped. The dominant story that comes out is one that affirms and celebrates the superiority of the West. The superiority of Western medicine in what it can do to save Africans. Of course, it did save Africans. But the manner in which it is done in a way that reaffirms the superiority, the sort of inherent superiority of the West over the other. So on March 23, 2014, the World Health Organization reported that 49 confirmed cases and 29 deaths from Ebola virus disease occurred in the forested region of southeastern Guinea, marking the official start of the West Africa's Ebola epidemic, the largest in the history. And if you just look at what I've read, on 23rd of March, the World Health Organization reported that there were 49 confirmed cases and 29 confirmed deaths from Ebola virus disease in the forested region of southern Guinea. I underline the word forested. For a point, for a reason. There are numerous descriptions that the World Health Organization could have chosen to provide a geographic description of the location of the epidemic. But they picked and emphasized the word forested for a particular reason. Of course, Ebola is a zoonotic disease, jumping from animals to human beings. But you do not necessarily have to emphasize the word forested. The juxtaposition of the word forest, Ebola, and Africans in one sentence provides a numbing portrayal of Africans as if Africans share the same habitat as animals. Let me see if I can do anything about it. I don't know if I... The juxtaposition is problematic. It provided a chilling warning that the outbreak of Ebola virus disease would be received with mixed feelings, would be received with prejudice and blame. The World Health Organization chose words and terms that are drenched with social and political significance in order to provide a characterization of the origin of the Ebola virus disease. If you look look at these maps, I just wanted us to have something beautiful to look at. I'm not going to show any slides. Sorry, guys. I'm on sabbatical, so I thought slides are so difficult to write. I said I would just prepare something that I would just read. So I just brought some notes here. Similarly, the hypothesis about the initial case of the Western Africa Ebola outbreak, otherwise known as the index case in epidemiology, is equally revealing about what was to come. The index case in the 2014 Ebola virus is believed to have been an 18-year-old boy. His name? Emil Wamono, from Melindo, a small village in Guinea, who is believed to have contracted Ebola virus from bats. The WHO website still carries a brief but very graphic account of the chain of events leading to the Ebola outbreak. The subject of the account, this 18 months old boy. Allegedly, he was seen playing in the backyard under a big hollow tree believed to have been infested by bats. It is intriguing and of course not difficult to notice the measure of speculation in this narrative. At some point in the course of the description, for instance, there is a concession that in fact the precise source of the infection is still a mystery. But it goes on to say that somehow it's likely to have involved contact between this 18 months boy and wild animals. I find that very problematic. Again, one does not necessarily need to be a scholar of African studies to decode the racial text that is built in this narrative. The symbolism is palpable. It plays into very deep-seated stereotype of Africans as existing in the lower ends of this evolutionary spectrum. A bit different from animals, but nonetheless in the same category as animals. Of course, as alleged in this description, looks like they share the same living spaces as, as wild animals. In fact, the hypothesis put forward by epidemiologists explaining the genesis of the Ebola outbreak in 2014 has Joseph Conrad written all over it. At some point, I thought, this must have been authored by Joseph Conrad himself. Although closely related to the issue at hand, this is not a place where I'm about to begin to lay bare epidemiologists' troubled historic relationship with the question of race. It suffices to say that I find it baffling that this hypothesis still gains a lot of traction in academic literature. As someone who was born in Malawi, the rural part of Malawi, and grew up there, and as a scholar of Africa, and as someone who is as someone with full awareness of life in rural Africa, I don't find this hypothesis to be resonating with me. 18 months old toddlers do not play with animals now. No mother does that. I grew up in rural Africa. I never played with bats. I never played with animals. And if you have seen a bat, if you have seen one, it's a scary animal. You can't play with it. I foreground these two rather simple encounters that I've mentioned to signal that I'll be making very heavy conclusions, which at first sight might seem somewhat out of proportion. I draw on the two encounters and a few others that will follow as I progress to demonstrate that the parameters of the discourse about the West African Ebola epidemic was already deeply dyed and warped and weft in racism right from the onset of the epidemic. The discourse served to other the African caught up in the epidemic and to portray them as everything and anything that the West is not. The very antithesis of the West, and therefore of civilization. Of course, believing that the epidemic was a product of Africa's own incivilities, the strategy of the West was, to take their time. Of course, believing that the epidemic would actually run into a dead end. Believing that at some point, the Africans will die and then the disease will have nowhere else to go. And then the problem will be over. Even as the writing on the wall demonstrated that this was a very different outbreak. Even as it breached security borders, i.e. for the first time forcing its way into highly populated urban areas of Monrovia and Liberia, the international community still thought that that was an African problem. Only when it jumped the Atlantic Ocean, then it was declared a public health emergency. An international public health emergency. It was not international public health emergency when it crossed the border from Guinea, Liberia, to Sierra Leone. It was when it crossed the Atlantic. In chapter 4 of Dying Colonialism, Frantz Fanon wrestles with the institution of medicine, arguing that medical science, being integral to the apparatus of the oppressive system, has always triggered in the native an ambivalent attitude. I borrow on some of his arguments to illustrate the ambivalent nature of the international response to the Ebola epidemic and to the global health policy in general. But when a discipline like medicine, considered to pertain to improving the health of the people, when its essential principle is pain, it's difficult to have a completely negative reaction to it. No absolute negative reaction can easily be justified. In other words, we need to understand and recognize the benefits that medicine brings to society. But I remain with the theme of the scale of violence endured by affected populations at the hands of the state as part of the crusade against the 2014 West Africa Ebola epidemic. These questions provide context for another set of broader questions that I ask. What is global health policy? What does global health policy mean for Africans? In asking these two questions, I arrived at the same conclusions as many scholars have, especially scholars of critical public health orientation or persuasion, i.e., the coloniality of global health. However, I do so from a completely different analytical pathway. I argue that as a set of principles and practices that make claims about how the world is and ought to be, global health policy in a Foucauldian sense is a form of intellectual technology that seek reproduce existing meanings, that seek to create new meanings, whether these be moral values, that seek to delineate legitimate health behavior from illegitimate health behavior, or that classifies or categorizes individuals or collectivities. I'll give an example of the West Point quarantine that happened in Monrovia in Liberia. As the number of Ebola cases mounted in Monrovia, Liberia, authorities decided to set up a treatment facility for individuals suspected of Ebola in West Point. West Point is a slum settlement of over 70,000 people, mostly poor people. This sparked a lot of backlash from local residents, justifiably. Why do you want to bring a treatment center from nowhere and put in our neighborhood and transfer patients from everywhere into our neighborhood? Not in my backyard. We all know that. There were protests, on the street. On August 16, 2014, a group of armed men attacked the clinic and looted the equipment and linen, driving patients out of the facility. While some patients were traced and brought back to the clinic, others remained at large. On August 20, that's about 4 days later, the Liberian government security forces surrounded West Point and sealed the slum off, placing it under lockdown. Violence erupted. Tear gas was fired, and 4 people were injured. In the international media, the root cause of the destruction of the West Point Ebola treatment facility was never properly explained. The destruction of this facility was ritualistic, was symbolic. People were angry at the way the government handled the siting of the treatment center. It was aimed to send a signal of antipathy to the perceived injustice and negative publicity that the township suffered because the authorities decided to unilaterally locate and build a treatment facility in the residential area. Instead, the international media was obsessed with images of the vandalized facility, which was interpreted as further proof of the irrationality of the African, providing fresh evidence of how man's vaunted intelligence, morality, and civility are mocked by the triumphant bestiality and violence of the African. These actions were widely seen as completely outside reason by those of us in the West. How can you go and vandalize a hospital? Such that even to try to explain this incident was seen as trying to legitimize it. It seemed to suggest that nothing short of heavy-handedness could work where these barbarians are concerned. There was more reason why those of us in the West were insulted by this incident. Of course, in part because probably the money that was used to build this facility may have come from, the international community. But ideally, it was so insulting because it insulted the credibility of medical science itself. The conversations in the media, however, were naive and uninformed. They were oblivious to the persistence of class hatred, for example, and cultural politics of class in the 21st century, where the poor tend to get a more than proportionate share of the blame for diseases. So, for example, in 1992, the Venezuelan government argued that the outbreak of cholera in that country was a direct result of the poor's daily habits, their uncivilized lifestyles, their diets, their propensity to eat crabs and all kinds of things. West Point residents who leveled down the treatment facility portrayed themselves as defending their relatives and their neighborhood against imagined state-led scapegoat. I choose the case of West Point to begin to show that the international community placed an unprecedented demands on Ebola-affected countries, resulting in local people's loss of social citizenship, dignity, solidarity, cultural identity, and livelihoods, and in some cases, life itself. Even when geared to promote and protect human rights. Disparities in resource and expertise between the West and these affected countries meant that the international response to the Ebola epidemic was never going to be a negotiated contract. It was always going to be tilted in favor of one side. Social resistance to public health interventions like the case that I've just read, is not uncommon during disease epidemics, especially in contexts marked by intense distrust between community and authorities. Where there is lack of engagement with local communities, such kind of social resistance is expected. Where there's adverse publicity, where there's communication failures, you expect that. There's so many examples in history that speak to that. Especially if you look at the history of the cholera epidemic that swept through Europe, for example, in early 1930s and in late 1880s. Such that if you look at certain chants and slogans such as Ebola is a lie, for example. Here, if people come in, they don't leave alive. I.e., the social psychological reactions of local communities that offended and disappointed the international community evoke memories of the 19th and 20th century public outcry of the cholera epidemic in Europe. In the wake of that epidemic of the 1930s, in the wake of the first pan-European cholera outbreak of 1930, violent riots spread across Eastern and Western Europe, from Sicily in Italy to the Baltic Sea, from Russia to Ireland. and across the Atlantic cities of North and South America, leading to murders of surgeons, doctors, pharmacists, nurses, etc., etc. Across different cultures and economies, the nature and character of the cholera rumors, mistrust, conspiracy theories, and target of rioters' anger was strikingly similar and well coordinated. Without social media, without internet, or any obvious means of communication between the rioters from New York to Asiatic Russia, similar stories of elites conspiring with medical profession to mastermind the curing of the poor with willful poisoning reverberated back and forth across the Atlantic, triggering widespread discontent and oftentimes riots. But when similar things happen in Africa, they attract a different kind of interpretation. I want to move to the Wome killings in Guinea. On a September day in 2014, in a peaceful village, a simple public health information campaign turned into a deadly massacre. The planned lecture about Ebola had just begun, but the village had heard enough already. A group of women started shouting, warning the others against the visitors. They are coming to kill you. From nowhere, a mob of machete-waving men with their faces covered in masks abruptly showed up at the scene of the meeting and rushed towards the speakers, pelting them with stones. And before too long, this Ebola information and education campaign scene became a murder scene. 2 days later, authorities recovered bodies of 8 people from a school pit latrine, toilet septic tank. 2 of them with their necks slit. Very gruesome scene. Two doctors, 2 journalists, I think a couple of nurses, a politician, and a pastor lost their lives in very unfortunate circumstances. The dead who had come to Wome, about a village of about 5,000, the dead had come to Wome, a village of about 5,000 people, to teach Ebola, where local officials, doctors, a journalist, and a popular pastor. The killings shocked the conscience of the world at a time when the globe was already mired in the frenzy of the epidemic. In response, the media invaded Wome in a bid to round up the suspects. In the process, killing scores of villagers. The media also looted homes, forcing thousands of villagers to flee their homes. Because of the sin committed by a few individuals, the whole village was punished. More than a dozen villagers died in starvation while in hiding in the forest. Some have since returned, but the saga is over. Some have returned, the saga is over, but theirs is a place deeply troubled by stigma and shame. The above incident epitomizes the nature and the extent of social dislocation wrought on local people by the response to the Ebola epidemic. Homes were torn apart as family members and relatives suspected of Ebola were forcibly taken away from communities for treatment and never returned. Due to the extremely high fatality rate of Ebola, the overwhelming majority of the family members taken to treatment facilities simply died. Communities resisted sending their family members to these treatment centers. Health workers, accompanied by military personnel, rounded up families suspected of the virus shipped them to treatment centers, and were never seen again. Families were almost left in the dark, never notified about their death, the death of their loved ones, not to mention the cause of their death. Because of this, the identification and the referral process of suspected cases for treatment was met with a lot of resistance. This was particularly the case in Guinea. In Liberia and Sierra Leone, there was resistance, but in Guinea it was very spirited for colonial reasons that I don't have time to explain. Sometimes the punishment accompanying the punishment for non-compliance with government prevention decrees took the form of fines. The government in Guinea, for instance, introduced hefty fines in a wider effort to clamp down on street barriers, on secret barriers. Afraid that family members taken for treatment would never return, communities resorted to organizing secretly amongst themselves the burial of their loved ones. Some chiefs responded by imposing equivalent fines of their own on their own subjects, so counter fines. If they see you talking to a health worker and giving them information about what is taking place in the village, you are also fined in your own village. This had the effect of unraveling the social fabric, pitting communities against each other, undermining the much needed sense of solidarity that everyone required for effective implementation of public health programs at such a dire time. I want to move on to another episode. Do I still have time? Okay. I'll try to be, I think I'm close. In June 2014, President Salif Johnston of Liberia announced that her government would start cremating the remains of Ebola victims. Reached in consultation with the international partners involved in the Ebola crisis, the decision was in direct response to the challenge of quickly and safely disposing human remains amidst rising death toll. Initially, the government in Liberia had used burial teams, local people specially trained to safely dispose of human remains resulting from Ebola. Even this was very controversial. The massive burials, the mass burials that were taking place, people were just taken and just dumped in mass graves, and that was the end of it. But as the death toll mounted, burial teams grew exhausted and could not cope with the job. Hence the introduction of mass cremation as a public health intervention to contain the spread of Ebola, because Ebola is actually most infectious in the immediate aftermath of death. So at 9 p.m. each night, it begins. Thunderous sounds announce its arrival, piercing the silence that accompanies sundown in the swampland near Boyston, Liberia. The concrete building from which the sounds emanate shakes from the impact, rattling the colorful houses on the dirt roads nearby. Hot orange flames leap in the sky, discharging sickening, inescapable stench of death, burning dead bodies. The introduction of this preventive policy sparked widespread moral outrage. The backlash took different forms. The most visible one, running street battles between authorities and the protesters. Cremation is indeed an effective strategy for reducing the transmission of the virus, but it is one that touched on a raw nerve. There was public denouncement that the government of Salif Johnston had kowtowed to the ill-conceived policy advice and had abrogated its responsibility of standing up for the values that gave the Liberian society, life. While a growing volume of work is devoted to understanding how live bodies are handled in the wake of epidemics, very little research has focused on dead bodies. Yet, the treatment and the fate of the dead body might provide insights into the biopolitics and restorations that shape the international response to the epidemic. The practical and symbolic treatment of the corpse that died of Ebola raised intriguing questions about the relations between groups of people caught up in the crisis, i.e., it reveals the administrative structures involved in the treatment of corpses, the structures of power and reappropriation in the context in which bodies are viewed as objects that are subject to incineration, and a great deal about those behind this policy and how they see themselves, their approach to and the nature of the violence. Of course, corpses create biohazards that resulted in the continuation of the epidemic. But the gruesome burning and the dramatic incineration, the mass incineration of human remains of the Ebola epidemic created a lot of trauma on families. That drove people away from treatment centers and from complying with the directives of the state. According to Hindu tradition, a culture that is closely associated with cremation, the burning of the human remains by families or family members symbolizes not destruction, but construction. The burning of the human body after death represents new creation, since all beginnings must end, thus paving way for beneficial changes. But for Liberians, mass incinerations brought collective humiliation, shame, and dishonor. And it actually relieved the legacy of slavery. One father of an Ebola victim said, "The government told us that the World Health Organization and the Center for Disease Control had advised us to burn the Ebola bodies." One Nelson Sion, involved in the burning of the bodies, said, "We take every single dead body and we burn it," says Nelson, who works on one of the teams. Dealing with the living is one of the most difficult aspects of the job, he says, because he knows how important grieving can be. But no one gets their body back, not even the ashes. There's nothing physical left to mourn. In a country home to freed slaves, the graphic burning of human remains during the Ebola crisis at the behest of the international community evoked very deep memories. Burning of bodies, human bodies, is not a new phenomenon for those similar with the history of slavery. Being burnt alive was a punishment reserved for slaves who committed the most outrageous crimes, such as murder or running away from your owner sometimes. The burning of Lucy, a Choctaw slave. Who was Lucy? Not much is really known about Lucy. She was simply a black woman enslaved in Choctaw. She was burnt. Actually, she was burnt along with the body of her deceased slave husband, Prince, who had admitted to killing. Southern sentiments towards black life prevailed in Lucy's case, and this is one of the earliest incidents where a culture of lynching as entertainment was recorded. Word spread quickly throughout the territory. A live slave woman and her dead husband were going to be burned. No outrage was expressed, and nothing was done to prevent this act. And in fact, curiosity was aroused. The burning of Lucy and the remains of her dead husband was going to be entertainment. And people from many miles around were said to have packed up the family to come and watch Lucy and her deceased husband burn. Her burning and her husband's burning was simply entertainment. Last page. So what is global health policy? I want to come back to the larger question that I want to speak to. How do we understand global health policy in relation to the health challenges facing Africa? I draw on the works by Robert Jenkins to argue that a key part of answering this question requires that we examine the generic concept of global health as if we were anthropologists. So an anthropological position, it's an epistemic position. I can even call a geographic distancing sort of position, i.e., we should actually assume that we are strangers. In other words, global health policy, especially in relation to international response to Ebola outbreak, should be treated as something to be interrogated and not something to be taken for granted. In other words, the task is to ask, what is global health policy? What does it do? What does it mean? Global health policy as meaning. Rather than accepting global health policy as a conventional aspect of the modern world that everyone in some sense understands, we should look at global health policy from a naive perspective of a stranger. Bureaucrats tend to define policy in technical terms. For example, as an attempt to define, shape, and steer orderly course of action, especially in situations of complexity and uncertainty. Involves specification and prioritization of ends and relationship between, involves specification and prioritization of means and ends and the relationship between them. These are important conceptualizations, although insufficient for understanding how global health works, global health policy works, and why it works the way it does. My argument is that global health policy produces and communicates meaning. It constitutes and is constituted by meaningful practices, codes, and categories. It provides an important vehicle and instrument for production and reproduction of shared meanings about health and other moral issues. From this vantage point, I'm concluding, global health policy may reinscribe the status quo, or call into being new or modified meaningful practices, codes, and categories. Although there is always an effort to portray these policies as value-free, bureaucratic, technical exercises, when viewed from this point, it becomes apparent that global health policy is inseparable from culture, or cultural politics, be it cultural politics of race, cultural politics of class, cultural politics of gender, etc., etc. Thus, culture is a vital aspect of global policy, health policy, and global health policy is an important dimension of culture. I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy not to respond, but I facilitate the responses to the questions.
Rather insightful presentation and for taking us back to the year 2014, focus on the Ebola crisis and how, and the response to the Ebola crisis at the international, national, and even the local level. So at this point, we would like to open the floor for questions, discussion. So I don't know, do you want to take individual questions or a block of questions?
Maybe we can take 2 or 3 at a time and then
Sure, 2 at a time. Okay, so
facilitate a discussion around that and then take another class.
all right. Okay, so we have about 15 or so minutes for questions. Yes.
So one of the people that you mentioned early on in your presentation was Joseph Conrad.
Yes.
That is someone I am unfamiliar with. Could you give us a bit of background about him?
There's a question about Joseph Conrad.
Any other question?
Okay, right. Okay, yeah, you go first. It's okay. Yeah, you go first and then you go next. Yes. Pardon?
Like what I...
All right, okay.
Oh, no, sorry, I was just...
Oh, wait.
It's not a crime to ask a question.
Yeah, that's, you get your hand up. And maybe you can just respond to the question.
Does anybody else know Joseph Conrad? Can you please describe Joseph Conrad and some of his writings?
Basically, he was a writer, I think, British?
Yes, British Polish, yeah.
Yes. Polish, okay, sorry.
British Polish, what nationality?
Oh, both, okay. Basically, what I'm familiar with him for is the novel Heart of Darkness, which is infamous for its extremely racist and racialized rhetoric regarding the Belgian Congo.
Yes. Exactly what she said. You just have to read the novel. Many of us must have read it. I would be surprised if you haven't read it. It was even part of, in Canada, it was part of the school curriculum. It's a very celebrated novel.
Maybe I could also add that I watched the novel 2 years ago on Amazon. I only managed to read just 3 pages. I just because it's so deeply racist.
So if you read Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, if you find it so offensive, there is a response to Joseph Conrad's novel, written by Chinua Achebe. Read Things Fall Apart. At least you should read one of the 2. You're better off both, but either way. Because they are mirror opposites. Chinua Achebe wrote Things Fall Apart in direct response to Joseph Conrad's depiction of the African in the context of Congo, juxtaposing, life around the Congo Basin and Congo River with Thames River inland, and it's a graphically racist depiction of Africa. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about how the global response to Ebola is similar to or different from the global response to HIV and AIDS? That may be a long answer, but like the short version.
Anybody who might want to? I think they're different as well as similar. There are differences and similarities. If you look at the discourse around HIV, right? That if that's why I didn't want to talk about it, because epidemiology is heavily implicated in the racist character of the discourse of HIV. Just the way the kind of methods that were used to sort of bring to the fore and initiate the conversation around HIV. So if you look at how HIV is almost synonymous with Africans or maybe Haitians, you know, and how it has been, how the response has also mirrored some of the things that I talked about. So, for example, in one of the papers that I assigned, maybe I might be talking to a smaller group of students tomorrow about that, I talk about male medical circumcision. You know, male medical circumcision as a strategy for HIV prevention. Yes.
So as a physician who practiced through that era when HIV became prominent,
Yes.
it wasn't until it really affected white men, given gay white men,
Yes.
who were also pariahs in their community largely, but still treatment didn't really come to the fore in this country until it affected white men. If it would have stayed in Africa,
Probably.
we still wouldn't be treating it effectively.
Or even the medical science around HIV wouldn't have progressed.
Right.
Because these also affect funding priorities. So money has gone into HIV, research funds have gone into HIV, partly because, your name, sir? Your name, sir? Yes?
Hope.
Partly because what Hope
Yeah.
is talking about. These things are so deep-seated. These are structural issues that shape a dimension of a range of issues, including how we decide on where money should go for research.
So in the news, maybe about a month or two ago, in kind of a large public health study, they researchers have documented how algorithms, in particular, health algorithms within a number of different ways, reproduced racist and deeply problematic assumptions that have direct consequences on the health of particularly people of color. So as a geographer, and as a geographer who's taking history very seriously, how would you respond to these findings, and what would you like people to know that aren't being discussed in the immediate kind of popular press about these studies?
It's a very good question, and it's one that I've wrestled with. I think it's part of it is bring awareness. The methods are not. Part of it is what I've seen in my own work is that there are people who use, for example, quantitative statistical modeling epidemiology. Very good stuff, like, you know, very insightful stuff. But in some ways, not much attention is paid to how the use of certain kinds of methodologies
does not go far enough in revealing, you know, the prejudices. So the methods may just be silent about the prejudices, and that's a problem as well, because the method is not robust enough or nuanced enough to be able to respond to issues of social justice. So the method might be okay, but how you actually use them, you have to understand that they have limitations, and you have to find ways of compensating for those kinds of limitations. So I also do a lot of epidemiological research. I do a lot of statistical modeling, and it comes with a lot of concern sometimes when I'm doing these things. And I either follow up with another paper or when I'm making presentations about it, I make sure that people understand the limitations of the methodology that I'm using. And that's part of how you can respond to some of these. But I think there is other ways of dealing with these problems as well. But it's very problematic, as you say. It's a very problematic piece. Yes.
So you talked about instances in the response to Ebola where governments responded in ways that failed to treat their citizens with respect or consideration. Did you have any good examples of governments responding to a public health crisis in a way that takes those sorts of things into account?
You seem like you have an answer.
No, I don't, yeah.
What do you think? Have we seen examples where maybe government have not fully taken all concerns, but have made a really significant effort to balance, you know, to check all the boxes of all what we sort of consider as public health principles. Like, if you're going to have a public health intervention, it has to meet these 5 or 6 principles, proportionality, whatever, all this. Yes?
I have a really interesting observation that maybe not answers that question, but I think is that I wanted to share. So in Nigeria is one of these countries and spaces where the government was lauded for taking a quick and proactive role in from within hours, within a day of when the first case of Ebola was first identified in the country.
Yes.
And one of the things that I found in my own work in Nigeria and talking to other people who were involved in the response was that one of the ways Nigeria was different than other countries was the people who were the tracers, the women and men who were in these communities were redeployed or were the polio vaccinators kind of around the country. And when the outbreak came, they took these teams of people who had been doing community-based work and said, we are going to use these already existing structures and bringing them into these areas. And so in this ironic way, the continuing or lingering polio epidemic that was in Nigeria that has brought this global response that has trained large numbers of people who sometimes successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully have managed polio were what actually made one reason of many others that made Nigeria's response actually somewhat more successful. So as much as Nigeria is in the news for its failure to curtail polio, it actually might have been one of the things that made its response more effective than in other contexts.
Yes, I think that's true. I also would like us to bear in mind that an epidemic like Ebola is not a simple one, given just how you can lose your entire population just like that. So I can also understand the calculus on the part of politicians in terms of, because that's a national security, that's a national security threat of very significant proportion. And if you're a country that doesn't have money, like Liberia or Sierra Leone, and you have a team of international experts that are putting their lives on the line to help you, quell the fire, I can understand the need to oblige, or the desire to be seen as so the politics are complicated. So we just also want to bear that in mind, that I think in some ways the decisions that we're taking in the best interest of the public. I think we also need to acknowledge that to some degree. They may not have been the most optimal ones, but they may not have been the most morally sort of justified. But I think it would be completely, unreasonable to think that it was just sort of, a power-hungry, draconian regime that just wanted to cut down on it. Yes.
One final question.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Sure. Back to the morbidity of cremations.
Yes.
Were there any rituals performed before the cremations of the bodies? In the absence of that, was it more of a pragmatic, expeditious kind of response to make things happen?
In the heat of the moment, my understanding was that let's get the bodies out of the streets, away from people, so that they don't pose additional risk, because the focus was on getting rid of any additional risk of exposure to what we have. And these were mass cremations, so relatives did not even get a chance to get samples of the ashes, for example. People were just, 15 bodies would just be heaped together, oil would be poured on top, set ablaze. That was pretty much the modus. Thank you so much. Thanks for the presentation.
That was a presentation by Professor Paul Mkandawire on the response to the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. You're watching Salina Media Connection.